Hi boys and girls, welcome back. This is one of my favorite stories. I know I keep saying that, but it's a true story and it's fairly recent, and that's why I like it so much. Now before I start, the riddle is why are dogs like phones? Think about it. Okay, the story is Nubs, the true story of a mutt, a marine, and a miracle. Now, the author is also part of the story, Major Brian Dennis. It's also by Kirby Larson and Mary Nethery. Nubs. Outside a border fort in the desert of western Iraq, a small thin dog watched and waited. His ears had been cut off to make him a dog of war. He had no name and no person to call his own. Despite his size, he was the leader of his pack, a group of wild dogs that survived by eating the desert mice and rats and scraps from the Iraqi soldiers stationed at the fort. Here's a picture of the dog. His name is Nubs because he has little nubs for ears. As the dog scanned the desert for a possible meal, the stillness of a fall morning was broken by the roar of engines, rumbling closer and closer. He hunkered down in the sand. 3 military Humvees carrying Major Brian Dennis and his 10 Marines lumbered to a stop. They were part of the Border Transition Team 352, there to help train the Iraqi soldiers. But the dog without ears cautiously approached Brian, who knelt down on one knee to meet him. The other pack of dogs raced to meet the men. So there's a pack of dogs, but Nubs is by himself. I call him Nubs because his ears look like little nubs. Later that night, Nubs and Brian ate dinner together. They shared Brian's MREs, or meals ready to eat, of spaghetti and Cajun beans and rice. For dessert, Nubs had sampled a strawberry Pop-Tart, wagging his tail. Later that evening, Nubs stayed with Brian when it was his turn at guard duty. Together, they kept everyone safe. Now, here is a postcard, you know what that is, of a note that Major Dennis sent home. I found a dog in the desert. I call him Nubs because his ears look like little nubs. We clicked right away. He flips on his back and makes me rub his stomach. I taught him to sit and shake in about 5 minutes. The next day, Brian gave Nubs an extra long belly rub. Then he stepped into his Humvee and drove away. The whole pack chased after the vehicles, but quickly lost interest and turned back. Not Nubs. Running faster and faster, he tried to catch up with Brian. He ran for more than a mile. He had no way of knowing that it was against the rules for Marines to have pets. Left behind, Nubs stared at as the Humvees disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert. Poor Nubs. You think that's the end of the story? Nope. Long, lonely weeks passed without any sight of that trio of Humvees and the Marines called Scout, Boss, and Chuck. At the fort without Brian, there were no belly rubs. Winter's cold winds began to scour the desert, leaving Nubs scrambling for someplace warm to sleep. As the pack leader, he faced constant challenges from the younger dogs wanting his job. Sometimes groups of dogs from other forts fought Nubs and his pack over the little food they had. Nubs lived his rough, harsh life, waiting for each time Boss carried Brian back to him. It's a tough life. Then Brian writes a note. Our last trip north, I was expecting to see Nubs again. I didn't. We didn't make it as far north as we did last trip, but I still thought I'd see him. I hope that crazy little dog is okay. What do you think? Near the end of December, when the temperature dipped to a bone-chilling 30 degrees, the Humvees again rumbled up to the border fort. The pack dogs ran to greet Brian, but not Nubs. He hung back, gaunt and weak, from a deep wound in his side. A wound is an injury. Shivering from pain, Nubs allowed Brian and the team medic to clean the wound and apply antiseptic ointment from the men's first aid kits. He even swallowed one of the child-sized doses of antibiotics Brian gave him. But Nubs refused to eat or drink. It hurt so much. He tried to sleep standing up. Poor Nubs. Look at him. Brian writes a note home. We tried to put a blanket on Nubs when we bedded down for the night in the desert, but he wouldn't let us. I said a prayer for him. He slept near me. It gone down to 18 degrees that night, and I kept waking up to check on him. Every time I woke up, I wondered if he'd be alive. When Brian got up at 4 a.m. for his turn at watch, Nubs stiffly padded to his place beside him. Head and tail drooping, he faithfully made the rounds with Brian. The next day, Nubs watched as Brian and his team prepared to leave. He touched his nose to Brian as Brian bent down to pet him goodbye. He felt Brian's head on his and heard him whisper, "Hey, buddy, you need to eat. You need to get better." Then Brian climbed into Boss, and the 3 Humvees pulled away. Determined not to be left behind again, Nubs chased after Brian. He couldn't keep up. Alone, he returned to the fort. Two long weeks later, Scout, Boss, and Chuck thundered up to Nubs' fort again. This time Nubs was there to greet them, tail wagging, but still moving slowly. For a few peaceful days, Nubs stuck close to his human pack. Brian took special care of him, doctoring his wound every morning. Nubs gobbled up his share of Brian's MREs, especially the beef patties. They wrestled and played, "Give me 5." Brian rubbed Nubs' belly every time he asked. If Brian stopped too soon, Nubs pawed him and made him rub some more. Each night after the sun set over the desert, Nubs and Brian did their job together. Under an ice-black sky of 1,000 stars, they kept watch over everyone. All too soon, it was time for Brian to leave again. Nubs followed close on his heels. Brian tightened his winter scarf, a keffiyeh, around his neck, and then climbed inside the Humvee. He leaned out and said to Nubs, "You take care of yourself, buddy." The vehicles rolled across the desert slowly at first, then picking up speed, heading for the command outpost far away on the Jordanian River. Nubs cried as he chased him across the cold, coarse sand. Because of his wound, he could not keep up. He dropped to the ground, exhausted and completely alone. Poor Nubs. When Nubs sat up, Scout, Boss, and Chuck were out of sight. He struggled to his feet and began walking. Nubs trekked mile after treacherous mile across the desert, shivering through frozen days and nights. There was little to eat and even less to drink. With barely a moment's rest, Nubs pushed on, fighting his way through the territories fiercely protected by wolves and wild dogs. So this is the trip he's making. Two snowy days and 70 miles later, Nubs limped into the Iraqi battalion headquarters where Brian was working. A team member ran inside shouting to Brian, "You're not gonna believe who's here." When Nubs saw Brian, he ran with his tongue out and tail wagging right into his arms. "What are you doing here?" Brian said as he held Nubs close and rubbed him all over. Nubs finally felt warm again. He pressed his wet nose against Brian's cheek. Nubs watched Brian climb back into Boss, ordering his team back to the command outpost just a half a mile away. "I know we're not supposed to have dogs at the outpost," Brian said to his men, "but if he follows us, what can we do?" When the Humvees began to roll, Nubs trotted right behind them until they reached the command outpost. Starving and exhausted from his ordeal, Nubs wolfed down pancakes, eggs, and sausages the Marines brought him. He made dog angels rolling over and over again in the freshly fallen snow. A few days later, he found brand new doghouse built just for him. Oh. Nubs liked living at the command outpost with Brian's men and all the other soldiers. He proudly wore a collar the Marines had fashioned from woven bracelets sent to them from school children back home. He cheered up his new friends, collecting belly rubs and making them laugh. And even though he had his own house, most nights Nubs curled up in the barracks with Brian and his team. But everything was about to change. Nubs sat close by. Oh. Okay, I got it. Nubs sat close by as Brian emailed his family and friends back home and supervised the men as they put up flyers to raise money. I think we lost a page here. Okay. Yep. We were given 4 days to get rid of the dog or else. Uh-oh, someone told and they couldn't have the dog. Nubs sat close by as Brian emailed his family and friends back home, and he supervised the men as they put up flyers to raise money needed for his journey. This is another letter he wrote right here. This all came to a crashing halt when 2 soldiers who were not part of our team reported us. We were given 4 days to get rid of the dog or else. That night I sat down and talked to my Marines. We knew if we took Nubs to the fort, he would come back to us. This made the decision easy for me. Nubs was going to America. This dog who had been through a lifetime of fighting war and abuse was going to have a nice sunny life and would never be cold again. Save the Nubs Fund. We're trying to evacuate Nubs to the States via Jordan. It's going to cost $2,000 or more to do this. If you want to help save Nubs, bring a small cash donation. Any bit will help. You can even come visit him in San Diego when we get there. This dog found us after walking nearly 70 miles in the desert, and we are going to help him. He is an awesome dog. That was the flyer. Nubs was the first to hear the good news. Family and friends wanted to help. Nubs posed for his passport photo. He took 3 baths in 3 days to get ready for his trip. This was tiring, so here's Nubs and his passport. That's the paperwork you need to go from one country to another. On the last day, Brian packed Nubs' brown blanket and his favorite superhero toy. Brian made a leash for him out of rope. Nubs didn't play with anyone as he usually did. Instead, he sat quietly in a corner. When it was time to go, Brian scooped him up and put him in Boss. Together, they drove to no man's land, the zone between Iraq and Jordan. There they met the brother of Brian's interpreter, who had agreed to help get Nubs from Jordan to the States. He was escorted by a Jordanian official. Nubs rested in Brian's arms as he was carried to a Land Rover. He felt Brian's breath tickle his ear. Be good, buddy. Don't cause any trouble. These guys will take good care of you. I'll see you in a couple months. I promise. So Brian couldn't go with him. Nubs sat at the border checkpoint for hours as officials pored over his paperwork, making sure everything was in order. Finally, Nubs arrived in Amman, Jordan. The king of Jordan's veterinarian gave him his first checkup and shots. He stayed at the vet's kennel while his travel was being arranged. This is another postcard from Brian. I had my interpreter call his brother every 30 minutes. I wanted to know when Nubs was headed out on the highway to Amman. I was sending him off with strangers. I was worried I'd never see him again. 2 weeks later, Nubs flew the 10-hour flight from Amman to Chicago. Friends of Brian picked him up at the airport. Nubs ate steak and strawberry Pop-Tarts for dinner. A few days later, Nubs flew out of Chicago to the last leg of his long journey, and that's going to be to San Diego. So from Jordan to Chicago to San Diego. When Nubs stepped off the plane in San Diego, he was greeted with banners and all kinds of cameras. He patiently waited and posed for the paparazzi. But he was glad to leave the airport crowd with Brian's friends, Eric and Chrissy. Nubs slept in a comfy new dog bed. He tried all kinds of tasty food and went for walks at the dog park. Well, it's official. Nubs is in San Diego living a good life like a little rock star. I can't wait to get home and take him to the beach. Someone was missing. Who's missing? Who do you think Nubs is missing? On March 23rd, 2008, Chrissy drove Nubs to Camp Pendleton. The paparazzi were there again. Nubs waited and waited. Finally, when he saw Brian, always makes me tear up. Nubs leapt into his arms and covered him with kisses because they missed each other so much. Today, Nubs and Brian lead a busy life. They play at the dog beach and cruise around in Brian's trucks. Sometimes they go running or a hike in Mission Trails Regional Park. Nubs romps with his friends Bogey and Kublai. Nubs even goes to school. His trainer Graham gives him straight A's. What a good dog. This small dog has done amazing things in his short life. He chose to travel 70 miles alone across the desert to be with Brian. It was a miracle he survived. The bigger miracle may be that the dog of war chose to become a dog of peace. Now Nubs has a name and a person to call his own, and he shares the friendship and love he found with everyone he meets. But Nubs saves his best kisses for his best buddy Buddy Brian. Got tongue. And that's the end. Now, unfortunately, this book was published a little bit a while ago, and Nubs has passed away. But they have other dogs, and Brian got married and has 2 children now. If you want, you can look for Nubs the dog on Facebook and follow the family. Kind of fun. Oh, answer to the riddle. Why are dogs like phones? Because they have caller ID. Get it? A collar around their neck has their ID on it. Bunny, I miss you. I love you. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.